Hey everyone, so I'm going to use this video to review the different macroeconomic viewpoints or the different ideas of aggregate supply, the Keynesian ideas and the new classical ideas. While you're technically not really required to talk a lot about the classical viewpoint, I like to start with it because the new classical viewpoint is basically building on the classical viewpoint. Also, the Keynesian viewpoint was a response to the classical viewpoint. So let's talk about the original viewpoint, the classical viewpoint. The assumptions of the classical viewpoint were that wages and resource prices are completely flexible, and that the economy will always gravitate back to its potential output. The economy will always self adjust and return to its full employment level of output, YFE, which is right here, down here, okay? This is the classical aggregate supply curve. Any increase in aggregate demand, like say from aggregate demand from AD to AD1, will cause wages and resource prices to rise, thus will only raise the average price level and cause inflation. You can see that an increase in AD only ends up raising the average price level without changing real GDP. Any decrease, sorry, in AD from AD to AD2 will cause wages and resource prices to fall and thus will only lower the average price level. You can see moving from AD to AD2 leads to a fall in the average price level, doesn't really change real GDP. The main idea here, or the implication, is whether there's an expansion, a boom, or a contraction, recession, the economy will self adjust through the rise and fall of wages and resource prices. And thus, the economy will always bring itself back to its full employment level of output or its potential output, YFE. The main idea is, therefore, the government should just leave the economy alone. And this was basically the main viewpoint of classical economists, is that the government should just leave the economy alone and the economy will self-adjust, or the economy will automatically adjust and bring itself back to full employment. Now, the classical viewpoint was really good throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century when economics as a science was still at its infancy, right? A lot of people trace economic thought to the 18th century, the late 18th century, with the ideas of Adam Smith. The classical viewpoint persisted throughout the 19th and the early 20th century as many parts of the world were gradually industrializing. But then something happened that shook the classical viewpoint and hence led to a challenging viewpoint, which is the Keynesian viewpoint. And that was the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit in the early part of the 20th century, there needed to be a revision of how economists view aggregate supply. And hence that led to the rise of Keynesian macroeconomics. So, what is the Keynesian viewpoint, which, as you remember, emerged as a challenge to the classical viewpoint? So, the assumptions of the Keynesian macroeconomic viewpoint are that wages and resource prices are only flexible in the upward direction, but there's downward inflexibility of wages. If the economy is stuck in recession, if the economy is in recession, it can remain stuck in this recession because wages are downwardly inflexible. Wages easily rise, but it's very difficult for them to fall during recession. And as a result, the economy can remain stuck in this recession. When there's a recessionary gap and the economy is in recession or a prolonged recession, a depression, an increase in AD, like for example, from AD to AD1, so this increase here, will cause an increase in real GDP without causing any inflation or any rise in the average price level. Why is that? Because there's a severe recession. There's lots of spare capacity in the economy. There's a very high level of unemployment. Once the economy reaches its full employment level of output, YFE, okay, any further increase in AD, for example, from AD2 to AD3, will not increase real GDP and will be purely inflationary. It will only cause inflation. Why? Because there's no more spare capacity. The economy is at its full capacity. The main idea or the main takeaway is that the economy can remain stuck in a recession or a depression as wages are downwardly inflexible and will not fall to help the economy self adjust. You know, the classical viewpoint was that in a recession or depression, wages will fall, and this fall of wages will help the economy self adjust. Keynesians believe wages will rarely or ever fall in a recession or a depression, and so the economy will be stuck, it will not self adjust. Therefore, it is the government's responsibility to intervene and attempt to increase aggregate demand. Do you see the implications of this difference in assumptions? Keynesians believe that wages will not fall, and hence, in a recession or depression, the economy will not self adjust. It is actually the government's responsibility to intervene and try to increase aggregate demand. Now, there are also other, sometimes more accurate depictions of the Keynesian viewpoint, which is basically this region in the middle. So, the more accurate viewpoint of the Keynesian viewpoint, you still have the more accurate depiction, sorry, of the Keynesian viewpoint, you still have average price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. Okay, so same assumptions. Wages are downwardly inflexible. Wages are flexible in the upward direction, but they're inflexible in the downward direction. So this Keynesian viewpoint splits the Keynesian aggregate supply curve into three regions. Region one, which is this region here, that is completely horizontal. In region one, there's lots of spare capacity. Any increases in AD will lead to an increase in real GDP without causing any inflation. There will be no rise in the average price level. Why? Because unemployment is really high. Businesses can afford to employ more workers, and aggregate demand, if aggregate demand is increasing, and this encourages businesses to employ more workers, this increase in aggregate demand will not be inflationary. Why? Because there's lots of spare capacity in the economy. In region number two, you have a regular upward sloping portion of the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. I'm circling it here. That regular upward sloping portion, the economy is close to full capacity. Economy is approaching its full employment level of output, its potential output, YFE, but not quite there yet, which means any increase in aggregate demand will lead to an increase in real GDP while causing some inflation. If the government attempts to increase AD, if the economy is operating in this region of its aggregate supply curve, this will lead to an increase in real GDP because the economy is not yet at full employment, and it will also cause some inflation. And then there's region three. Region three here is when the Keynesian aggregate supply begins to look like the classical aggregate supply. The economy is at its full capacity. The economy is at its full employment level of output. Any increases in aggregate demand will not lead to any increases in real GDP, but will only cause inflation. Any increases in aggregate demand will be purely inflationary. The economy is operating at its full employment level of output, Y. FE. This is another depiction you might see of the Keynesian viewpoint. And the real difference here is just region number two. Okay, you can also draw that and it will be very accurate. It's very important to remember to label a Keynesian aggregate supply curve as Keynesian aggregate supply. It is not a long run aggregate supply curve. There's no short run and long run in Keynesian analysis. There's only lots of spare capacity, close to full capacity, and at full capacity. So the Keynesian viewpoint became very popular after the Great Depression and after World War II until the 1970s. Something happened in the 1970s in so many economies around the world that Keynesian economists could not explain. In the 1970s, there were lots of oil crises, and these oil crises, they resulted in stagflation. They led to stagflation, which occurred in many developed economies. And Keynesian economists or Keynesian analysis doesn't really have a way of explaining stagflation. Let me quickly tell you what stagflation is. So stagflation is a situation where the average price level is rising, so you have inflation, while real GDP is falling. You have both higher inflation and higher unemployment. In Keynesian analysis, usually when there's high unemployment, inflation is low, when there's low unemployment or zero unemployment, inflation is high. But what if you have both high unemployment and both inflation? Keynesian economists couldn't really explain stagflation. And that's why the Keynesian viewpoint kind of fell out of touch, and this gave rise to the new classical viewpoint. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen, the new classical viewpoint. Now, new classical economists, they analyze based on the short run, which is the period of time where wages are not flexible. This is the fixed wage period. And they have a long run in their analysis, which is the period of time where wages are flexible. This is the flexible wage period. So remember, in the short run, according to new classical economists, wages are not flexible. This is the fixed wage period. But in the long run, wages are flexible. This is the flexible wage period. So let's have a look. Remember, the x-axis and the y-axis do not change. You have average price level. You have average price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. So let's see what happens according to a new classical economist if there's an increase in AD. Well, in the short run, AD will shift from AD to AD1, creating an inflationary gap, which is the gap between YFE and YIG. This distance between YFE and YIG is the size of the inflationary gap. Okay. In this inflationary gap, the economy's actual output, YIG, will exceed its potential output, YFE. This will push the average price level up from APL to APL1. You can see a rise from APL here, the intersection of the original three curves, to APL1, where you have an increase in aggregate demand. So what happens in the long run? Well, in the long run, remember, this is the flexible wage period. Due to the rise in the average price level, workers start demanding higher wages. And so wages begin to rise, which increases the costs of production across the whole economy. When the costs of production across the whole economy rise, this will lead to a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, shifting SRAS to the left from SRAS to SRAS2. Because remember, short-run aggregate supply is determined by the costs of production. When there's a rise in the costs of production, SRAS will shift to the left to SRAS2. The average price level will rise further from APL1 to APL2, and the economy will come back to its potential output, its full employment level of output, YFE. So you can see the increase in aggregate demand created a temporary inflationary gap, which led to a rise in the average price level from APL to APL1. This inflation will lead to a rise in the cost of production because workers will start demanding higher wages, which causes the short-run aggregate supply to shift to the left, causing a further rise in the average price level from APL1 to APL2, but bringing the economy back to its full employment level of output. Now remember, at YFE, the full employment level of output, the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. There's always some unemployment in the economy, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay, that's called the natural rate of unemployment. But when there is an inflationary gap, the unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, the unemployment rate is very, very, very low because the economy, its actual output is operating beyond its potential output. Now, what happens if there's a decrease? What happens if there's a decrease in aggregate demand? Remember, in the short run, wages are not flexible. This is the fixed wage period. In the long run, wages are flexible. This is the flexible wage period. Okay, so let's see what happens in the short run. In the short run, AD, let's assume there's a decrease in AD from AD to AD1. Okay, this will create a deflationary gap where the economy's actual output, YDG, is lower than its potential output. So you can see here the gap between YFE and YDG. This gap right here is a deflationary or a recessionary gap. This will push the average price level down from APL to APL1. You can see the average price level falls from the original equilibrium point here to APL1, where you have a decrease in aggregate demand. Now, what happens in the long run? I'll use blue to highlight the long run. In the long run, again, that's the flexible wage period. Due to the fall in real output and the economy being in recession, workers will accept lower wages. The economy is in recession now. Workers will accept lower wages. As a result, wages begin to fall, which decreases the cost of production across the whole economy. This decrease in the cost of production will increase SRAS, shifting it to the right from SRAS to SRAS2. You can see in the long run, short run aggregate supply increases, shifting to the right. The average price level will fall again from APL1 to APL2, from APL1 to APL2. And the economy comes back to its full employment level of output, comes back to its potential output. Now remember, at YFE, we said unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. But when there's a recessionary or a deflationary gap, the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, which is why new classical economists believe that in the long run, workers will accept lower wages. Wages are flexible, and this is what lowers the cost of production and bring the economy back to its full employment level of output. So what's the main idea here in the new classical viewpoint? Well, wages may not be flexible in the short run. An increase in AD will cause an inflationary gap, while a decrease in AD will cause a deflationary gap. Another name for a deflationary gap is a recessionary gap. However, in the long run, wages will adjust and return the economy back to its full employment level of output, YFE, its potential output. Thus, again, the implications, the government need not intervene in the economy. The economy will self-correct. In the case of a recession, wages will eventually fall, and in the case of inflation, wages will eventually rise. The government does not need to intervene. The economy will eventually self-correct. So let's quickly summarize the assumptions and the implications. In the Keynesian model, the assumptions are there's a downward inflexibility of wages. Wages may rise during inflation, but rarely fall during a recession, which means the economy can remain stuck in a recessionary gap. The curve has three parts. The horizontal part, there's lots of spare capacity, which means you can increase real GDP without experiencing any inflation. There's the regular upward sloping part where the economy is close to full capacity. This means any increase in real GDP will come with some increases in the average price level. There will be some inflation. And then there's the fully vertical part where the economy is at full capacity, at full employment. Remember, in Keynesian analysis, there's no short run versus long run in Keynesian analysis. This is very important. The implications of Keynesian assumptions are that the government needs to intervene during recessions to boost aggregate demand using both fiscal and monetary policies, which are demand-side policies. What about the monetarist or new classical model? The assumptions are wages may be fixed in the short run, but become more flexible in the long run. Thus, the economy can experience inflationary or recessionary gaps in the short run as wages are fixed. But in the long run, wages will rise in the case of inflation or fall in the case of recession. And so the economy will self-adjust and return back to full employment, return back to its natural rate of unemployment. What are the implications of new classical or monetarist viewpoints? Well, the government should not intervene to manipulate aggregate demand during recessions, as the economy will self-correct. But the government should focus on increasing the quantity and quality of FOPs, which increases the long-run aggregate supply, LRAS, in the long run, using supply-side policies. You can see a Keynesian economist and a monetarist or new classical economist would give very different advice to the government during recessions. I hope this was a good summary of the main macroeconomic viewpoints, their assumptions, and the implications of those viewpoints. Have a great rest of your day.